So our December worship theme is humility. So I want to approach this sermon speaking from a place of humility. We are, all of us as a nation, grappling with some very difficult challenges, some of which I'm going to talk about today. And these challenges don't have neat, clean, and consequence-free solutions. I don't claim any special insight. I certainly do not claim to have answers. So I hope you accept this sermon as a wrestling of sorts and an invitation to wrestle with me and for us to wrestle as a community. And if some of what I say strikes a chord in you or has some value for you, then good. And if not, well, the music today has been fabulous, has it not? Can I get some more appreciation for Mr. Onestine? And this is what I'm grappling with. Far from here, in miles, if not in awareness, there's a tent city that has been hastily constructed on our southern border in Tijuana. 5,000 people are living on a soccer field in the rain, in tents. Leon Krauss, reporting for Slate magazine, is at the scene, and he describes the camp this way. Thousands of small tents covered the baseball field. Some were proper camping tents, battered but still standing after almost 2 months on the road. Many were just makeshift shelters made out of plastic bags, blankets or sheets tied to poles, fences, and trees. Migrants slept on pieces of cardboard, thin sleeping pads, or the bare, uneven ground. Along the complex's main walkway, people had used small enclosures to assemble other minuscule shelters. Some were built with branches, twigs, and other debris resembling fragile beaver dams. And he continues, as I walked toward the back of the camp, I found a family of 4 sleeping underneath what can only be described as a paper cave, layer upon layer of deconstructed cardboard boxes held together with tape. As I approached, a child peeked out, curious. Her mother pulled him back so forcefully that the whole structure began to shake. So who are these people? Well, they're men and women and children, mostly from Honduras and Guatemala, who have walked together since October, traversing thousands of miles and untold dangers to escape poverty and violence. Gang violence, drug violence, government violence. A woman in the story describes her child's father having been killed by a gang, 2 of her brothers having been killed by a gang, and her own children facing the choice of joining that gang or also risking their lives. So to stay in place has become impossible, and she joined the long walk north to the U.S. to apply for refugee status, which I should point out is a legal thing to do, in fact an internationally protected right to apply for asylum. They had been told conditions would be favorable for them as refugees at the border. The reality has been quite different. Now, certainly, our nation has the right to secure its borders. Certainly, we have a right to define the process by which people legally enter our country, stay here, work here, and become citizens. Certainly, we knew that 5,000 tired, hungry, and traumatized people were going to show up on our doorsteps seeking our help. And certainly, some in positions of power and influence portrayed them as an invading horde, using starkly racist imagery, portraying them as people bent on exploiting, robbing, cheating, and even doing violence to us, to our country. Certainly, we do not have infinite resources. Certainly, we are the richest country in the world in human history. Certainly, we cannot take in everyone. Certainly, we bear some responsibility for the conditions that these people are fleeing. And certainly, it was with the heaviest of hearts that I absorbed the images of American Border Patrol agents whose salaries I pay, firing tear gas into a crowd of asylum seekers, the clouds enveloping women and children. The so-called caravan of asylum seekers is a small taste of what lies ahead for us. A small taste. The coming century will be marked by mass movements of people, both inside countries and outside countries. It is already happening. It will continue to happen. It will accelerate. Some of this will be driven by global economic disparities. Some of this will be driven by war and violence. Some of this will be driven by climate change, as the habitable landscape literally alters under our feet. And this, incidentally, will aggravate economic disparity, war, and violence. Some of this will be driven by social media and new ways for people to communicate, organize, and mobilize themselves. A wall will not erase this reality. All the tear gas in the world will not erase this reality. And I humbly suggest that the future is going to require us thinking quite differently about global problems and global solutions. And to get to these new ways of thinking, we're going to need a new narrative. A new narrative. We're going to need a new collective story by which we understand how the world naturally works. Because there's a narrative that exists now about who belongs and who matters. It isn't brown people for the most part. It isn't poor people. It isn't people who are not like us for certain values of like us. There's a narrative out there that says we're all in this alone, that we're isolated, separated. If you want to be idealistic and put a positive spin on it, say we are rugged individuals. But we are separate and alone, rugged individuals. And there's a narrative that says that fear is an appropriate response to our aloneness. Fear of those who are not like us for some values of us. And we have to act to protect and preserve what is ours. That's a narrative that's been around for a long time in this country. We don't need to talk about where the narrative came from right now. It doesn't exist by accident, but we can leave that alone for right now. It's an old story. And I will suggest that we need a new narrative. A new narrative about who belongs, everybody. And a narrative that says we are in this together. That we are not alone, not isolated, but interdependent. A narrative that says a reasonable response to our interdependence is to love and care for one another. Is that easy? Will that be easy? No. No, it won't. We need to get creative about figuring out how to love and care for one another. We need to get brilliant about figuring out how to love and care for one another. But without that new narrative, we're not even headed in the right direction. We're just staying put, building up walls, and walls are not going to solve our problem. Not when California is on fire and the ice caps are melting and the sea levels are rising. Walls are not going to solve this. To get to this new narrative, one of the things we can all do is challenge the old narrative. To recognize it when we hear it, especially when we hear it coming out of our own mouths, and we will, and to challenge its assumptions. Why am I supposed to be afraid of this person? Why am I supposed to do this thing that I'm being told I should do to protect myself? Why is this protection? Why am I pulling this trigger? Ethicist Miguel de la Torre says, we need an ethics of messing with the system, he calls it. Since the system is so messed up, he says, we need to mess with the system. Now, I've heard this called a different thing by Unitarian Universalists. I've heard it called being a holy disruptor. Holy, H-O-L-Y, disruptor. Because when we hear the old narrative, when we see it doing harm, when we find ourselves caught up in it, we can disrupt it. We can challenge it. We can challenge our part in it. We can refuse to play the role we've been assigned within it. We can disrupt it at our dinner tables, with our friends and family, in our jobs, in the decisions we make about how to spend our time and our money. We can disrupt it. Wait, who can? You can? I can? We all can? Since our worship theme for the month is humility, here is my humble proposal. We can disrupt the old narrative. We can start building a new narrative. And in this way, in a small way, which maybe is a big way, we can eventually save us all. We can, I can, you can. And if you're feeling humble in response, you might say, not me. I don't have that kind of power. I don't know how to do that. I'm just a regular person, busy with my life. So regarding holy disruption and humility, I want to share today two stories from the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. And I picked these stories today to tell you for two reasons. One, because tonight is the start of Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah for everyone who, yourself or your families, observe it. And I wanted to honor the Jewish tradition within Unitarian Universalism, which is a living tradition. There are many people within our religious communities who come from a Jewish background, who identify as Jewish, who practice Judaism. Right? So these stories that I'm going to share with you are alive within our collective faith. And I want to honor that. And secondly, I wanted to choose two stories from the Hebrew Bible because the Hebrew Bible is a book that is all about the refugee experience. Cultural and political exile are circumstances that appear again and again in the Bible. Its heroes are refugees, immigrants, exiles, foreigners, wanderers. And that is why again and again in the Bible we are enjoined to welcome the stranger and to treat him or her or them with kindness and dignity. These are the foundational ethics of the Bible in a country that supposedly takes this book and its ethics very, very seriously. That is what it is all about. If you don't understand welcome the stranger, you need to read that book again. So two stories. The first is the story of Moses, the hero of the Exodus story. If you don't know the story, Moses is an Israelite who was born in Egypt. And because the Pharaoh, the Egyptian king, is afraid of this growing group of people in his kingdom and the power that they might have, he issues a decree that says that all of the newborn Jewish male children must be put to death so their numbers don't grow. But a woman chooses to be a holy disruptor. She doesn't pull the trigger. She doesn't carry out the order. Moses is left unharmed and he's hidden away. And eventually he's adopted and raised by an Egyptian noblewoman as an Egyptian within the palace. But Moses knows his true heritage. And one day while he is out riding, he sees an Egyptian overseer who is beating a Jewish laborer in a field. And to protect his kinsmen, and in a fit of anger, he kills the overseer. And now recognizing that this is treason and he's in deep trouble now, he flees the country to a neighboring kingdom called Midian. So Moses is now twice a refugee. He's a cultural refugee, an Israelite raised Egyptian, and he's a political refugee as an Egyptian living in another land. But there he works hard for many years. He gets married into a prosperous family. He becomes a farmer and a herdsman. And many, many, many years have passed. And one day Moses is out shepherding his flock, and as the story goes, God appears to Moses as a burning bush that is on fire but is not consumed by the flame, which is very curious. And Moses thinks it's curious, and he's like, maybe I'm going to take a look what's going on here. And out of the bush, God says, Moses, I am the God of your people, and I got some great news for you. You are going to free your people and lead them out of Egypt. And Moses says, nuh-uh. More specifically, he says in the Bible, who am I to do such a thing? Who am I? It is the most human of questions. Whenever a moment opens up in history, whenever a possibility opens up in the world like a bridge to something new, and we are invited to step forward or to roll into it, it is the most human thing to ask. Who? Me? Me? Who am I to do this thing? And Moses even presents God with some really specific excuses for why he can't free his people. He's like, God, I am terrible at public speaking. I hate it. Like, ask me anything, but not public speaking. But, spoiler alert, Moses does go on to free his people, leading them out of slavery in Egypt, through the desert, and to the promised land. So now there's the story of Esther. Okay, this story takes place much later in Jewish history, maybe 1,000 years later than the mythical Exodus story, if such a thing can be dated. During an era when the Jews have lost their kingdom and they're living in exile in Persia. Okay, so again, a story of exile. And Esther is a Jewish woman who is living in disguise as a Persian woman inside the Persian king's palace, having been raised by the king's advisor, who is also secretly Jewish. So again, cultural exiles. And in the story, Esther, who's living in disguise in the palace, wins the heart of the king. And as a mark of his favor, they get married. Of course, he's got many wives, but Esther is the favored wife. He makes her his queen. And this sets up a very cushy life for Esther, like living in her own place in the palace. But she learns from her advisor father that a wicked person is poisoning the king's mind against the Jews, and the king is going to grant permission by royal decree that all of the Jews may be killed by anyone who wants to kill them and take their stuff. They can be killed, they can be driven out. The details and the motivation don't matter too much. The point is that Esther is safe, but her people are in terrible danger. And her advisor father beseeches her, Esther, talk to the king. You have his ear, and the king loves you. If you tell the king the truth about who you are and ask that your people be saved, he might do it. And Esther says, are you kidding? She says, I'm not allowed even to approach the king, for it was death to approach the king without being summoned. That was how they rolled back then. It was death to do a lot of things. But for sure, one of those things was to speak to the king without an invitation. That's death. And Esther says, the king hasn't asked to speak to me in 30 days. As if to say, to underscore, do you see how unimportant I am? I'm not even on the king's calendar. I could not possibly approach the king. So even a queen says, who am I? Who, me? Because this is human. This is a modesty that denies us our power at the very moment when we are asked to claim it. This is a humility that reminds us that we are alone, and fear is a reasonable response to being alone. And the advisor says to Esther in response, maybe it is just for such a time as this that you became queen. So he challenges her to a different kind of humility. A humility of service that says, whether I feel ready or not, whether I feel powerful or not, it's not about me. It's about the moment that I have been invited to enter into. So Esther speaks to the king, and she claims her power, and she saves her people. Now, probably none of us are going to be in a position like Moses or Esther, right? We're not going to save an entire people, not by ourselves. But the idea that we're by ourselves, that we're alone, is precisely the old narrative. And we may not have the power of a Moses or an Esther, but we do have the power of holy disruption, because we always have the power to say no. We have the power to question. We have the power to challenge the assumptions in the world and in our own head, because they are for sure in our own head and in our hearts, about who matters, about who belongs, about who we're supposed to fear, about who is our neighbor. We have the power to speak out and speak into a moment. We have the power not to pull a trigger. So I want to close today with a selection from a poem by Ross Gay, from his poem entitled A Catalogue of Unabashed Gratitude. It is in its way a paean to holy disruptors. And I like the gratitude because gratitude and humility are so closely linked. And gratitude is so much a part of this new narrative that we need, because when we are grateful, We are recognizing how much we are in need of one another and how much every moment is so much larger than ourselves and supported by so many things that came before and will come after. So Ross Gay writes in a catalog of unabashed gratitude, "Thank you. Thank you," he writes, "to the woman barefoot in a gaudy dress for stopping her car in the middle of the road and the tractor trailer behind her and the van behind it, whisking a turtle off the road. And thank you to the man all night long hosing a mist on his early bloomed peach tree so that the hard frost would not waste the crop, the ice in his beard and the ghosts lifting from him when the warming sun told him, 'Sleep now.' Thank you. And thank you, the ancestor who loved you before she knew you, by smuggling seeds into her braid for the long journey, who loved you before he knew you by putting a walnut tree in the ground, who loved you before she knew you by not slaughtering the lamb. Thank you. Thank you who did not bulldoze the ancient grove of dates and olives, who sailed his keys into the ocean and walked softly home, who did not fire, who said, 'Stop, stop, don't do that,' who lifted some broken someone up. Thank you. My friends, there will come a time when we too will be invited to sail our keys into the ocean, to say, 'Stop, stop, don't do that,' to lift some broken someone up. When that moment opens before us like a bridge to a world waiting to be born, let us not shrink back in self-protective humility and say, 'Who am I?' Let us say instead with gratitude, 'Here I am.'"